Okay, the first thing that I want to do today is just review a little bit of what we did last time. We talked about different kinds of texture, one being actual texture, and this is an example of actual texture. It shows actual thick paint on the surface of this work, which is called impasto. In this work, it's very difficult to see, as it is with most slides or illustrations in books. It's awfully hard to see the actual texture. Where you see the little white flecks in this work, most of those are actual paint that's sticking up from the surface, and if we touched it, we would feel that it's very rough. Then another kind of actual texture that an artist can create is mixing paint with various materials such as sand, concrete. This particular one, the artist mixed paint with plaster and applied it to the surface. You can also, an artist can also create actual texture by gluing things to the surface. When an artist does this, it's called collage. Collage just means to glue to a surface. And here this artist attached a spoke of a wheel, also a small metal wheel, probably from a baby buggy, and then he also painted on it. It could be pieces of paper, any kind of thing that an artist picked up and glued onto the surface would create actual texture also. And then another kind, let me also mention, that of course buildings can have variation of texture, as can sculptures. Then another kind of texture is implied texture or visual texture. And that is texture that's not actually there. If we ran our hand on this painting, it would be very smooth. All we would feel would be just the smoothness of the oil paint. But the artist creates the illusion that there is texture there, like the fur on the bottom of the man's gown, the felt of his hat. And the artist creates it by using line, color, light and dark values in order to create that kind of effect. In the next work, we see some of the details, such as the wiriness. He uses line here, rather dull treatment of the, and not as much saturation, but a rather dull treatment of the hair of the dog to give it that wiry effect. Whereas up in the chandelier, he really creates a very strong sheen to the chandelier. So this is what we call implied texture, and this was something that developed in the Renaissance because the artist wanted to create naturalism, and the way to create naturalism partially was to make sure that you recorded all the different kinds of textures that you saw in the world. It happens in sculpture as well. This artist, Bernini, was a Baroque artist who could, by just using the values of light and dark and his carving techniques, could create the feeling that this hand here in this detail is really pressing into soft flesh. It's not soft, it's marble, so it's a very hard surface. And yet, by just the way that he treats the lights and shadows and the way he carves it, he gives you that effect that we're looking at very soft sort of flesh. And so these were techniques that were developed in the Renaissance period, mainly to create naturalism within art. Another thing that this kind of treatment creates is the illusion of depth, that you're looking at depth in a work of art. And part of the reason that is done or can be created is that in the foreground, where we see the trees and where we see the detail of the bark or the leaves or the stones that they're standing on, the artist is very careful to give them that implied texture. But as we go back in that illusion of depth to these mountains up in the background, he reduces the amount of texture. And so we believe, we're not as close to those mountains, and so we're looking at something that's much farther away. Another way that texture can be used is for expressive effects. Here, this artist has created this head, almost looks like a skull, by pouring melted bronze into a mold. And he could have smoothed off that surface so that it looked all very shiny and very smooth. But he wanted to leave the surface looking very rough, sort of as if it's been gouged, in order to create the feelings, that this is a human that's sort of been attacked. He was an artist working right after World War II, and many of these artists had seen, people tortured and killed, seen them very wounded in World War II, and he's trying in a way to tell us about that in the way that he treats this very rough surface of this head that he is showing us. Then another kind of thing that is listed with texture in art is pattern. And pattern is simply repeating something, repeating a design several times to the point where you feel like you are seeing a pattern. Pattern is just a color, shape. And so here, for example, I brought in a piece of burlap that really allows you, to see that there's a repetitive sort of shape that is moving through all of this burlap. And so people have used that idea of pattern to also give some sense of texture in pieces of artwork. And this is just a modern example of an artist that used several different patterns. He wasn't trying to create naturalism. He was just trying to give you the feeling of what a Chinese restaurant was like at that period of time. Chinese restaurants back at the beginning of the 20th century, the Chinese were new immigrants into this country. They didn't have a lot of money. And so when they would decorate the restaurants, it wasn't trying to create the atmosphere of China. They just used whatever cheap materials they could in order to decorate the restaurant, get it up and running. And so they often used a lot of conflicting kinds of patterns like you see here, the checkerboard against this zigzag. And then the other kinds of designs, the wood sort of effect up in here. This is sort of looks like a linoleum kind of effect here. They didn't worry that the patterns didn't go together. It was simply a case of we want to get our restaurant up and running, and whatever is the cheapest way of doing that, we're going to do that. So this man is trying to tell you about a Chinese restaurant by using all these kinds of patterns without just giving you, a view of it, just showing you some view of a restaurant with tables and chairs and maybe lights or people eating food. He wants you to feel how it would be to be in one of those restaurants at that time and see all these different patterns. So pattern is something else that is also used sometimes to give a naturalistic effect and sometimes to give you more of an expressive kind of effect. Then finally, the last of these visual elements that we're going to talk about, and as I mentioned first time when we first started talking about this, there is another element that is included in your chapter. It's called time and motion. But since motion and time sometimes are involved in other of these elements, I don't talk about it individually. So the last one we're going to talk about for this class is space. And the word space in artistic terms can mean two different things. It can mean the flat surface, the picture plane of the surface. And this is a treatment of space that we'll get into more when we get into the next chapter, because placing things on that picture plane, on that flat surface of a painting, really has to do with principles of design, which is what the next chapter talks about. So I'm mainly going to talk about the other way in which space is thought of in art, and that is as an illusion of depth, creating that illusion that you're looking off into distance. And when that is used in art, the idea is always that the picture plane or that flat surface is like a window. It's like a transparent window. You're looking window and we're seeing all this distance go off away from us. It can be created in a lot of different ways, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute, or just all the different ways that you can create that depth. Here gives you a good example of what that picture plane kind of space is. This is Pollock's work. We've looked at it before. And he isn't really interested in showing us depth. He is interested in, dripping paint all across this canvas, top and bottom of the canvas. And he's really emphasizing the canvas. We see all these dripped lines, and we're sort of reminded of how he had to have moved or how his arm moved, in pouring that paint. And so we're really reminded constantly about that flat surface. So this is the kind of surface that we'll be talking about when we get to principles of design. The kind of space I'm going to talk about now, is creating that illusion of space. And the main reason that artists created that was to create naturalism. If you're going to have figures that you've modeled with light and shadows so that they look three-dimensional, if you've been very careful to give them all the detail of texture, to make them look real, and they're sitting or, they're placed on a flat surface, they're still not going to look real because there isn't any space around them. They look like they're floating. They don't look like they belong to some place. So another thing that Renaissance artists had to develop was a way to show that illusion of space in order to create naturalism. And I'm going to be referring to this several times as we go along here for some of the different ways that you can create space. One of the simplest is just overlapping. If you, create something recognizable, like a sheep here, or a goat, or these people, or these figures that look like people. Actually, these two are angels on either side, and this is Jesus here in the center. But if you create something recognizable and it seems to overlap something else recognizable, like you see here with the sheep, how they overlap, that creates the idea that there has to be enough space for that sheep to stand, and that there must be more space behind him if there's a sheep behind him. And so it's one of the simplest ways of creating this illusion of depth. It doesn't work very well, and these pretty much look pretty flat. They don't look like they have a lot of space around them. But it's a beginning. It's one of the ways to begin to show this illusion of depth. And that is what this artist did here. Here in the figures in the foreground, he has several figures. This man is overlapping this man behind, this one over this one. And so he has used overlapping as a way of beginning to create this illusion of depth. And then another thing that he has used is size. The way that depth is read in a Renaissance work of art, and it sort of has become the standard way that you're supposed to read depth in any work of art, whether it's Renaissance or whether it's non-objective, is that what is at the bottom of the painting is closest to you. And so the figures in this work are larger. And then as we go up to this level, up above these figures, they're supposed to be the closest to us. They're in the foreground. As we go up, the figures become smaller. And the idea is that we're supposed to understand that these figures are farther away, and that's why they're smaller. And, it's based upon what happens to us in our visual world. If we're standing right by a tree or a building, it's larger than we are, but if we look off into the distance, it looks like there's a tree over there that maybe is only 2 inches tall. It looks much smaller. Our brains say, well, that's not the case. We know that that tree is just as large maybe as the tree beside us, but visually it looks smaller. And so again, artists knew that they could use this kind of effect to help to create this sense of depth within the work. Not all artists have used it, and there are times in art history when Other ways of treating space, or size rather, have been used. For example, here in this Egyptian work, this man right here is the man that's mentioned in the title. His name is T. He was an administrator of the court of the pharaohs in the Old Kingdom period of time. He was probably a member of the family, because they usually were at that time. And he's shown very large, and then we have all these other figures that are surrounding him that look very small. They aren't children, even though, if here is the boat that he's standing on, and so we could say, all these little figures here are on the same level as, the tall figure there. But this is a case in Egyptian art where naturalism was not the intent. Now, they were trying to create a symbolic art, and so it was more important to them to show us who the most important person was, who the highest placed, in the society was. And since T was an administrator of the court, he was much more important than these little men here that are actually spearing hippopotamus. These figures that you see down here that look rather abstracted are supposed to be hippopotamus in the water that we're looking at, and they're spearing them. So, these are supposed to be adult figures, just like he's the adult. But this artist is using what is called hieratic scaling, or hierarchical proportioning. What hieratic means is symbolic scaling. So, symbolically, they're saying he's more important than all the rest, and so we're showing him larger. So it's not always been the case that size shows distance. It may show importance. It may have some other, symbolism attached to it. Another way of creating depth, or, that is also used within this work is placement. And by placement, I mean that this row of figures here that are smaller are placed higher in the composition. If we think of this composition as being like a ladder that's just going up vertically, and we have the first rung here with these figures, and then we have the second or third rung, being represented by these smaller figures back here. Again, the idea is just something that's accepted between the artist and the viewer, that anything placed higher than the bottom, then the figures are supposed to be in the foreground. Anything higher is supposed to be farther away. And so again, not only are they smaller, but they're placed higher in this composition. And then the buildings, still higher. And we can go at, trees back here, still higher. So the farther you go up in the composition, you're supposed to just understand that it's farther away in this depth that's being created. But again, this is something that doesn't always work in every culture. For example, here we're looking at a Persian work. And this figure, that is high up in this composition, actually seems to be larger than these figures down here. And this figure is not meant to be read as being farther away than the figures that are down in the bottom. In Persian culture and in a number of other cultures around the world, they would have said, if they looked at Renaissance art and saw these tiny little figures that are up higher in the composition, they would have said, but that's not true. People don't diminish in size as they move away from you. They're always the same size. So make them the same size. And again, what's happening here is also the idea of making the important person longer, and larger. And this person is supposed to represent Muhammad. And so he is larger in the composition. So again, other cultures have other formulas and other ways of treating not only size, but also placement in compositions. And so you have to be aware of that when you're looking at different art. What are the rules, in that particular art for how they treat things like this. Artists in Western culture, in Europe and the United States, have not only used these ideas of placement and size for naturalism, but they've also used them for expression. It's a way of emphasizing some particular emotion or something that they want you to feel in the work of art. And you see that here with Andrew Wyeth. This is called Christina's World. It's a very famous work that Andrew Wyeth did. Christina was a neighbor of his, and she could not walk. And this was in the time before, there were lots of wheelchairs. In the 40s, 1940s, 1950s, about the only place that you saw wheelchairs were in hospitals. Ordinary people, ordinary citizens didn't own them. And so he describes that he often went by the farmhouse where Christina lived with her brother, and he would see her crawling out in the fields. She tended the kitchen garden. She raised all the vegetables, and she did that by crawling up and down the rows of vegetables and picking the weeds and watering the vegetables. And so he said, he got to thinking about her world, how difficult it was for her, and how really the farm was her only world. She seldom went into town. Her brother usually went into town and did all the shopping that needed to be done. And so her world was that house and that farm. And he felt, like it was a very difficult world that she lived in. And so he decided to show us, his feelings about that by placing her, out in the fields as if she's very far away from this, from her home. And so to emphasize that, he has a very high horizon line, where we see the sky beginning is almost at the top of the composition. And he's placed the house up, at the very top of the composition. So that idea of placement, it's meant to say this house is really far away from her. He also makes it, very small. So again, that just augments that idea that this is a very, that the house is very far away from where she's located in the fields. And so, we're supposed to think about how she's crawling in the fields, trying to get back to that house, and we're supposed to empathize with her, and understand how difficult her life must be. So, he uses these basic ideas about how you create distance in a work of art in order to emphasize something, emotional. It's not just about naturalism. Although naturalism's involved with it, but it's mostly about, what her feelings are and how difficult her life is. Another way of creating depth is by using perspective. Perspective, first of all, is a word that just means any way of creating depth within a composition. And there are several different kinds of perspective. The first type you're seeing here is called atmospheric perspective, or another name for it is aerial perspective, A-E-R-I-A-L. But just, learn atmospheric. I won't use aerial on a test. What atmospheric perspective means, it means the effects that, again, we actually have. If we look off into the distance, it usually looks like things are slightly blurry, and particularly, I do a lot of driving out to Colorado, and the pollution in the air now, around the Rocky Mountains, around Denver and Fort Collins and that area, you can just very obviously see the atmosphere, see the air out there. We always think of air as being transparent. We don't see the particles that are in the air when it's up close to our face, but when you see it from a distance, you do see that there is a substance to the air. And so artists realized that a long time ago and realized that if they were going to represent something far away, that they could use these effects of atmosphere. And so in this particular work, the mountains that are back here in the background look much more blurry. Usually the artists create, whatever hue they're using, they will lighten that hue. They will sort of make it into a middle value. It won't be really light, won't be really dark. It'll sort of be in the middle there. Sometimes they will change the color also and make this background look sort of grayed or sort of blued out or purpled out to give you that effect of atmosphere. The textures are removed. We talked about that textures up front, up in the foreground. They really depict those so that we feel like we're close to it. And then again, as they go off into this atmospheric perspective, they decrease the textures. So they use all of these ways to give you the feeling that you're actually seeing atmosphere get between your eyes and this background scene. So that's one kind of perspective that they create. And then another kind that developed in the Renaissance is called linear perspective, or one-point perspective, or mathematical. It actually has lots of different terms. The reason it's called linear is that it's usually based upon setting up lines in the architecture, or a line of trees, or the line of a road, and having all those lines meet at one point on the horizon line. And so that's where the one point came from. And in the process of creating this, there are also mathematical calculations that have to go on about how tall the figures have to be if they're placed anywhere along this, these diagonal lines that are moving back. So here you just see a diagram. And, you can see it happen if you go over to the railroad track and stand for just a second in the railroad track. Not very long. I don't want any of you to get hit by a train. But if you stand right in the railroad track and you look off in the distance, it looks like those rails are coming together. Well, artists in the Renaissance, noticed this happen in the sides of roads, or, in the sides of buildings, lines of trees, things like that. They didn't have railroads to look, but you can really see it happening if you go and look at the railroad. This one point where everything comes together is called the vanishing point, because the lines seem to be vanishing or going together into one point. And this, again, is something that this artist used in this work. This work is one of, forgot to mention, is one of the works on the side walls of the Sistine Chapel. We always hear about the ceiling that Michelangelo painted in the Sistine Chapel. But before he ever painted in the Sistine Chapel, there were large paintings like this all along the sides of the Sistine Chapel. And so Perugino painted this in the Sistine Chapel, and he does use one-point perspective. He draws out the diagonal lines that we saw in that diagram. They're much clearer in the painting than you see here in the scanning. The scanning just didn't pick them up very well, but you can see some of the diagonal of the lines. And all these diagonal lines, if we drew them out, if we put a transparent piece of paper over them and tried to draw the lines, they would all come together right here in the center of the door, right on the horizon line. That's where the vanishing point would be. And then in this kind of system, when you're working with objects, you also draw horizontal lines that seem to come closer together as they go back into distance. And then you calculate how tall the figures or the buildings or other objects have to be based upon where they're going to be on this grid kind of system that's created. And actually, this artist didn't entirely calculate correctly. These figures at this level are a little bit too small for where he placed them, based upon how many of these grid lines you see going back. He made them a little bit too small. So again, one-point perspective was another thing that developed in the Renaissance in order to give us this convincing feeling that we're looking back into space. There's a problem, though, with one-point perspective. It implies we have one eye when we have two, actually. It also, in very large works like this, what tends to happen if you are looking, if you're standing sort of in the center and looking at this particular work, the edges over here on each side in your peripheral vision, they look like they're kind of bending away from that vanishing point instead of going towards it. And it's also a very rigid system. And so artists in the Renaissance eventually gave this up because they didn't like it, because they knew that there's this distortion that occurred on the sides, and because once you have established the grid system, which you have to do first before you do anything else in the composition, it sort of determines everything else. It determines how large the forms can be and, their placement within the composition. And so artists, and let me just go on, then I'll come back to this for a second. Artists began to change things. And one way they changed things was by how they treated foreshortening. Foreshortening is something that developed because they were using one-point perspective and because they knew they were putting, three-dimensional objects within that grid system. And so they realized, that the objects they were placing in that grid system would have to look like they were moving away into the back along those grid lines. You couldn't have it looking very flat or it wouldn't look naturalistic. And so what they realized was that when you depict objects, you have to foreshorten them. In other words, you have to make certain parts of them look smaller if they're going to work with this perspective system, even though they wouldn't be really smaller in nature. And Dali does that within this figure right here. The shoulders here of Jesus on the cross, his arms are larger than his legs. If we could somehow tilt him upward so we could see him standing on the feet, he'd have this really gigantic upper part of his body and really short sort of legs. So that's what foreshortening is. I can give you another example of it. If I pointed to someone and you were directly in line with my point, and I put up my hand like this, it makes my hand look like it's attached to my shoulder. You don't see the length of my arm. And so artists had, understood that, and so they would have to somehow shorten that arm if it were going to be seen correctly within this perspective system. So they had to develop foreshortening to fit with the perspective system, but what a lot of artists did, even in the Renaissance, was they sort of twisted that foreshortening around. And this artist is an example of someone that did that. Here we're looking at the feet of Christ, and the feet are at the bottom of the composition, so that means the feet are the closest to us, so they ought to be the largest. But this artist realized, using foreshortening, that if he depicted the foreshortening correctly, then we would have feet here of Jesus that might be this tall, and the feet would be disguising the body of Jesus. And since that was the most important thing for him, he decided to reverse the foreshortening. And so he began with the largest parts in the back, and as we come forward, they get smaller. So it's exactly the opposite of the way that the foreshortening ought to work. And so this was one of the, changes that artists began to make because they knew it to be a more effective painting. He knew what he wanted to show people was the body of Jesus dead, of Mary, weeping beside him, not his feet. That sort of missed the point, although you'd see the nails in his feet. But you wouldn't see his face, you wouldn't see his upper body. So he reversed it. Now, before we go on and I show you some other changes that happened, let me just go back. Once this one-point perspective was developed in painting, sculptors also used it. And so this artist, again, in the way that he depicts the architecture, we could draw lines in this architecture. We could follow the diagonal lines in the architecture, and we would see that in this work also, which is a sculpture, that there is a point, a vanishing point right in here where all these lines are coming. And so again, it does give you that sense of three-dimensionality even in sculpture. So not only did they change, begin to mess with the foreshortening and not use it as it had originally developed, they also began to use a different kind of perspective called two-point. And what two-point is, instead of going to the one point in the center, they set all the diagonal lines at an angle so that you saw one set going off on one side and you saw another set going off on another side. And so you had 2 points where these diagonals were coming together. Often in this kind of art, one of the points will be outside the composition and you can't see it. And you'll see that with this painting that I'm going to show you here. This is an example from about 2 centuries later where this artist has used two-point perspective. And here on this building, we see diagonal lines going back in this direction and coming to a point that's right over in this area. And then we see diagonal lines moving off in this direction, but actually, the point is outside. You never see where they all come together on this side. And artists like to use this better than the one point because, one, it has 2 points like two eyes. So it looks like it reflects more of what our seeing is really like, using two eyes. Also, it's not as rigid a system. They can just do more with it than in that one-point system. It's not so obvious, that there's this grid, that's being created that everything has to fit on. And so this was the type of perspective that developed by the beginning of the 1600s. Here we're seeing it much later, but by the 1600s it had begun to develop. And artists used it for, a couple of centuries after the 1600s to create art. And then there are other kinds of perspective as well because, this one-point, two-point perspective I've been talking about is mainly used in European art, and then Americans, copied it also and used it. But other cultures, with different ideas about what art should represent, developed other kinds of perspectives. And one kind that developed is called isometric. And it uses the idea of having 2 sets of diagonals going off on either side of a composition, but the lines never come together. There isn't any point. And this is the kind of perspective that developed in the Far East. And so here you see an example of a Japanese work in which we have diagonals that are going off, into the distance, supposedly, but never come together. It's a more symbolic sort of art. And again, the Japanese artist that did this might have said to us, well, those lines never come together. They may look like they do, but they don't really come together. So what's the sense of making them look like they come together? And so to the Japanese, also Chinese artists, this looked much more sensible. It still gave you somewhat of a sense of going back into space, but to them it was more realistic. It looked more like what actually happened. And then the word perspective has been used also to mean point of view, not just a device to go back into space or to show distance in space. It's been used as another word to mean, what point of view from which you're seeing things in a work of art. And often in art, multiple perspectives or multiple points of view have been used. And again, I'm using an Egyptian example because their art was symbolic. It was never meant to be naturalistic. It was never meant to look just like what we see in our world. And so here we have an example of that multiple perspective or multiple points of view in the way that this figure is treated. If you look at it, his upper chest area and his shoulders are shown to us frontally, as if he's standing and we're looking at him frontally. But from the waist down, he's in profile. And his feet are shown in profile, as if he's standing sideways to us instead of frontally. So they've twisted him, at the waist into this profile view. Actually, they use the same foot. It's the left foot. They just repeat it twice in the composition. The arms are in profile. And his head's in profile also. So we're seeing his head. We can see the projection of his nose. We're seeing his hairdo. And it's a little hard to tell here, but his eye is frontal, as if he's standing looking at us frontally. So they've combined different points of view from which we could see a human figure in this work. And so that makes it a symbolic work. It makes it abstracted. It's not really the way that we would see a human being. And the reason that they seem to have done it, they didn't leave documents that said, here's why we did it this way. And so art historians that study Egyptian art have concluded or think, that maybe the reason that they did this was because they wanted this figure to be very recognizable as a human figure. And they thought that seeing the shoulders and the upper chest, particularly from a frontal point of view, was a better way to show the upper part of the body rather than turning it, in a profile. Because when you turn it in profile, then you really just see the shoulder, the arm, one arm. You don't see this arm, this shoulder. And you don't get that sense of the expanse of the chest. So that may be why they created it. We'll never really know, unless we would find some document at some point where some artist tells us, why they did that. 20th century artists began to use the same kind of perspective because they didn't care about creating naturalism anymore. And again, in a way, they wanted to create a symbolic art. And so they began to also show objects from different angles. For example, here with this table, we're seeing the legs and the bottom of the table as if we're seeing them from a profile point of view. But the top of the table has been tilted up to us as if we're somewhere in the air, we're looking down and we see that, top of the table, and we see all the objects that are on the table. So here, two different points of view have been combined together in order to create this work. Space is also a very important element in sculpture, and so I want to talk a little bit about how it's used in sculpture as well. Here we're looking once again, at Michelangelo's David and the view of David that you have if you're in the museum. In sculpture, the sculptors have to think about actual space. When we were talking about painting, it was all an illusion. On that painted surface, it's a flat surface, a wall or a canvas or a board, whatever it's painted on. It's really flat. And the artist has to try and make you forget that it's flat and make you think you're looking off into distance. In sculpture, they actually use actual space, that surrounds a figure. And the way that they use it will emphasize the three-dimensionality of that figure or not. And so here, for example, so I'm using Michelangelo's example of David in order to talk to you about a couple of different things. This figure is what we would call in the round. And what that means is you could walk all the way around it, see it from all sides, and he did finish it in the back. If we had a view of the back, you would see he's holding a strap that he's going to use as a sling to throw a stone at Goliath. That David fought Goliath in the Old Testament, the Bible. And so he's holding onto the strap that he's going to use to throw the stone, and it's lying down his back. And if we could see the back, we would see, that Michelangelo actually showed that. And he also, gave us all the details of the anatomy from the back. So it actually is in what we call an in the round sort of figure. But it's actually a frontal figure, and by that we mean that you can pretty much tell everything you need to know about this figure from looking at it from the front. Michelangelo doesn't twist him a whole lot so that he disguises something so that you need to move around him in order to see, maybe his face or something else. We can pretty much see the whole figure and understand what's going on. Understand that he's staring off into the distance. He has a frown on his face as if he sees Goliath approaching, and, he's thinking about what's going to happen. So since we can see everything from the front, and there really isn't any twisting, we call this a frontal figure. It's also a closed figure, and what that means is that Michelangelo really doesn't take too much consideration about space around this figure. Everything is pretty much closed in to that slab of stone that he carved this out of. So for example, here in this arm, it's bent, and so our eye sort of comes out to that elbow area, and then the forearm leads us back to the shoulder, where he's holding on to that strap. So, this hand doesn't push us out into space. It doesn't throw us out into space. It really brings us back into the center part of the figure. This arm touches his thigh. So again, even though there's a gap there between the arm and the body, and so it seems to be a little bit out away from the body, he still brings us back. It's like there's a line on the edge of his form that pulls us right back into the figure. So Michelangelo is telling us, concentrate on the figure. That's what I've done. That's what I've carved. That's where all the story's told. That's where you can understand everything about this figure, is just concentrate on the figure. The only thing that sort of throws us out is his look, the way that he turns his eye, his head, and he looks very intently out in this way. And that throws us away a little bit. We sort of think about, well, he must be looking at something and contemplating it. So that's what we call a closed form. So Michelangelo really isn't too concerned about, the space around the figure. And that was the case with most Renaissance artists. They were just mainly interested in keeping a closed sort of composition. But in the following period of time, in the 1600s, the artists were much more interested in really using space that surrounded the figure. So this is David again, by a Baroque artist, and he creates an open form. And here we mean, that this arm is set on a diagonal, so think of it as a line. It sort of leads us through that arm and right on out. Another diagonal in the body. We're sort of led away from the figure in that way. A very strong twist, in the figure. And people have said, I have not seen this, I'm hoping that this spring break I'll be able to see this, but people say that when you walk into the room, the expression, the intensity on that face is so heightened that you almost feel like ducking. You sort of feel like he's getting ready to throw the stone at you. And so that expression really pulls us out also. So this art, and even though everything's hooked together, if you look down here at this arm, he's holding the stone, which is holding, the sling, and here's the other hand right here. So you are sort of led back in to this figure. But notice how the sling is a different color. So you don't see it as easily as you do, the marble that we see here. And so it sort of makes a gap, a break so that you get the sense that you're being pulled out away from the figure, not led back into it like Michelangelo had done. So in this way, this artist tries to create an open form. And it's truly in the round, even though Michelangelo's was in the round too. But this one's in the round because this one really makes you want to move around it. This hand looks rather strange from this angle. Is it growing out of his thigh? We assume it isn't, but we don't see the arm at all. And so that sort of pulls you around to make sure that the arm is there, and that it looks like a normal sort of figure. Just the twisting, you don't get to see this shoulder very well. So in twisting it like this, he really moves it around in space, and he sort of gets you involved in moving around in space too. So he utilizes space better in sculpture than Michelangelo does within his work. But it's not to say that Michelangelo wasn't a great artist. It just means that at his period of time, people didn't want to do that. They didn't want sculptures that twisted you around a lot. And in this period, they did. So in this way, this artist has also used space. And space has been something that 20th century artists have continued to use. This is called an assemblage because it's made up of many different parts. This is an actual counter from a fountain, probably in some drugstore somewhere, a real urn, real stools. And then the two figures are made by the artist, out of white plaster. And so, this really incorporates a lot of space. This is in the Institute of Art in Minneapolis, where I went to graduate school. And my son was convinced one time when we went by this that this was a real fountain where you could get a drink, and he, said, "Come on, Mom, let's stop, let's get a pop at the fountain." And it's because it occupies space, and everything looks very real until you notice these figures, and that's what I told him. When he asked that, I said, "Now look at the figures for a minute. Do they look real?" And he looked, and then he said, "No, they're white." And I said, "Yeah, because it's an artwork. It's not really a fountain where we can get a pop." But this takes a lot of space. It actually occupies a lot of space. You could walk if they let you. Of course, they won't let you, but you could walk behind that counter, or you could sit down on the stool. So artists in the 20th century have utilized more space to really try to create a feeling of reality, like you're seeing a different kind of reality. And that just increased to the point where in the latter part of the century, installations began to be created, which are room-size sculptures. We've talked about installations before. I showed you one by Anne Hamilton where, the entire room is a sculpture, and actually there was another room attached to the room of her sculpture. This is just one room, but, the walls are painted, objects are placed in it. So it takes up a whole room. It makes the sculpture, really utilize space, actual space. Okay. In architecture, we can talk about the same kind of thing because architecture also occupies space. We can't stand in it because in the area where a building is because the building's there. And so again, it depends upon the period of time how architects wanted to use space. And so here in this example, of this building, this is one of the buildings that was built for the Medici family, and then later the Riccardi family owned it. Here you have pretty much a feeling of a flat wall and not a lot of sense of the depth of the building from the outside. It just looks like a flat wall that's been divided into various horizontal strips and then, had windows put in it. And so it doesn't really look like it utilizes the space a whole lot or tries to emphasize it. This building, on the other hand, really looks like it's taking that space in. and using it, in an expressive sort of way. This is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, which was built by Frank Gehry. He's a postmodern architect. He also built the Disney Center in Los Angeles. It's very similar looking to this. He belonged to a period of time called deconstruction, when people began to try to break the rules, whatever the rules were. If you had a rule that architecture had to have flat walls and that architecture had to look very stable, then he wanted to make a building that looked like the walls were twisting. You have this piece right here, that looks like it's twisting, so that the top here looks like it's almost at right angles to the bottom, and yet it's one wall piece, that seems to be twisting. And so he tried to break that idea, that a building had to have flat walls in order to be a building. Another thing about buildings, usually they're meant to look very stable, so you get the feeling that they're not going to crash down on you. And you'll be safe in them. Again, he tried to, move away from that. So he tried to make this building by the kind of materials he used, and then just by the twisting sort of elements and all these different kind of elements. He tried to make the look, it looked like it was very active, like it was in the process of growing or changing, and makes it look very, unstable, is what it ends up looking like. So again, architects have experimented as well with how can you really use space within a building and make it a little more expressive or a little more interesting than just those flat walls and boxy sort of rooms that have been used in the past. Okay, these are, the various terms that I've used. And I will put this online once again in the course documents section. And of course, when we get ready for the next exam, I will also put them on the handout that I'll give you for the next exam. This is a rather long list this time because we've talked about a lot of different elements as we've looked through all of it actually goes to, I think, four screens. So there's quite a lot. I have an assignment to give you and to talk to you about a little bit, so let me turn on the lights and hand this out. This is another written assignment where you're going to get to practice using these visual elements that I talked about. So I'll wait until everybody gets this, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about it. I don't know whether you noticed or not, but on the test, and that reminds me, I don't have your test to give back to you. I showed them to you last time, but there were 3 people in the evening class that didn't appear for the test last week, and the graduate student tried to get a hold of them and couldn't get a hold of them. So we're still waiting on them to take the test, so I can't hand back the test to you. But you will notice, you may have noticed, that one of those questions that was worth 18 points had to do with the writing assignment you had done, where I asked you to discuss the different roles of artists and to find an example. You could have just taken the examples on that writing assignment and simply put them on the test, as an example of each of those roles. So again, this written assignment is like something that you will have on the test that's going to be coming up after we talk about principles of design. So let's talk about it just for a minute. I like for you to use actual works of art, but the exhibits in the art gallery right now are not the best for doing this. So what I'm going to ask you to do is go through your textbook. You cannot use chapters 1 through 5. It has to be chapters 6 to 22. Find a work of art that you want to talk about and discuss it, write a 3 to 5 page paper discussing it using these categories that I've given you here. And I showed you on this handout, how many points are involved in each of this. So I've given you lots of questions. You don't have to answer every question. Some of the questions won't have anything to do with the work of art that you choose. I'm simply giving you lots of questions so that you think about, each of these visual elements and, the kind of things I would want you to do. So I've taken each of them. If you go down to number 5, it is not worth as many points because texture is difficult to see. If it's actual texture in an illustration in a book, you really can't see it. If it is implied texture, you usually can. But I just didn't give as many points to that because it's more difficult. And number 7 also, where you sort of summarize your observations, I didn't give you as many points for that either. When you choose your work of art, don't choose it based upon, say, looking at it and saying, okay, this is a flat work of art. There's not going to be any space there, so I won't have to talk about that. I won't give you the 17 points if you don't talk about it. So it would probably be better to, look in, there's a chapter on Renaissance and Baroque, and, there's some other chapters in your book where you're going to see works of art that actually have each of these visual elements in them that you can talk about. It would be better to choose one of those works than to try and find a work that doesn't have most of this, because you think, well, then I won't have to talk about it. If you don't talk about it, you won't get the points. So it's better to choose something, where you do have each of these, and just go through each of them. You don't talk about the subject matter. That's not the purpose of this. Talk about how lines used and color and shape, all of those visual elements that we've been talking about. And I will put this online so that in case you need to go back and sort of review and look at something to remind yourself, you'll be able to do that. So it'll be on, but look in your book too. Look in chapter 4 where it talks about all these things in your book. Yeah. It is due in a week from today. I've tried giving longer times and students just always wait until the last minute anyway, so in a week. You might want to check online on Blackboard for this class. Some of you I know heard when I was talking to Andrew, my son's having emergency surgery, and I'm not planning to go up there, but if his wife for some reason thinks that I need to go, then I might not be back on Thursday. So look on Blackboard, and I will put an announcement on there if I'm not going to be here on Thursday so that you know, and you don't have to come to class. Okay? Any other questions about this? Yeah.
Is this paper single-spaced or double-spaced?
Double-spaced, yeah.
How many points is it worth?
It's 100 points in all. But, on the final grade, it's not worth as much as an exam. They're worth less. I think it's 5% of your final grade are these. But, I wouldn't just say, okay, I'm not going to write on it. It's worth those 5%. Okay?